The water was rising past Jason's knees when he saw her, the big striped shape wading toward Main Street with something held high above the current, something small and impossible, cradled between her jaws like a piece of blown glass. He forgot the catchpole in his hand. He forgot to breathe. Behind him, someone whispered, "Oh my God, oh my God," over and over again, and Jason still couldn't move. Before this story goes any further, tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from, and hit subscribe so you don't miss stories like this. That morning had started with rain. Not the kind of rain that Mill Haven, Kentucky was used to, not the soft summer kind that filled the gutters and made the whole town smell like warm asphalt. This rain came down like something that had been saved up for years. Jason Whitfield woke at 4:37 to the sound of it hammering the tin roof of his rental behind the sanctuary, and he lay there in the dark with the fan still turning and the sheet twisted around his legs, and he already knew. He had worked at the Crestwater Big Cat Sanctuary for 11 years, long enough to feel the pattern of the creek behind the property, the way a farmer feels his own field. Long enough to know when the ground was too soft and when the low levee across the pasture was going to stop being a levee. He got up, pulled on the same pair of grey coveralls he had been wearing since Wednesday, and walked out to his truck without turning on the porch light. He didn't need it. He had walked the path 1,000 times. The sanctuary sat at the far end of a narrow county road on a piece of land that the Halpin family had donated to a non-profit back in the 1960s. There were 2 lions, 3 tigers, 1 jaguar named Nora, a serval and a pair of caracals, 12 big cats in all, spread across 7 enclosures. Most of them had come from bad places. Backyard menageries, shuttered roadside zoos. 1 tiger had been pulled out of a semi-trailer in Missouri, dehydrated and half-blind. The sanctuary was the last stop for animals that nobody else wanted. Jason had always thought of it that way, though he never said it out loud. By 5:45 that morning, he had the radio on in the small operations office, and the voice coming through it wasn't the reassuring voice from the day before. The National Weather Service had upgraded the warning. The Ohio River tributary that fed the creek behind the sanctuary was going to crest at a level nobody currently alive in Mill Haven had ever seen. Jason listened to the bulletin twice, then a 3rd time, and then he picked up the phone and called Emma Reyes. Emma was 19, a first-year veterinary student at the community college in Owensboro, and she volunteered at the sanctuary every other weekend. She answered on the 2nd ring, and Jason didn't waste words. "Get here as fast as you can," he said. "Bring your father's boat if you can get it off the trailer." She said, okay. She didn't ask why. While he waited for her, he walked the property. The creek was already over its banks, spreading brown and slow across the low pasture. The levee, the earth mound that the county had refused to reinforce 2 years ago, even after Jason had gone to the commissioners' meeting 3 separate times and asked in the calmest voice he could manage, the levee was still holding. But Jason could see the water pushing at its base, could see the wet, dark line climbing up the grass. He knew who had voted against the reinforcement. He didn't let himself think about it, not that morning. There would be time for that later, though he didn't know then how much time or how strange the shape of that anger would eventually take. He moved Nora first. The jaguar was 3 years old, always the calmest of the cats, and she walked into her transport crate almost willingly, the way a dog might if she trusted the person holding the door. Jason latched the crate, loaded it onto the flatbed of the sanctuary's old pickup, and drove her up to the high pen behind the main office, where the ground was 15 feet above the floodline. He backed the truck up and let Nora into the temporary holding. The lions came next. Duke and Persephone, a bonded pair that had come from a shuttered cub-petting operation in Texas. They were harder. Duke was 10 years old and moody in the mornings, and it took 2 doses of the mild sedative the retained veterinarian had left in the fridge to get him into the crate. Persephone followed him once she saw him go. Jason drove them up separately, one after the other, and by the time he came back down the hill, the water in the low pasture was halfway to the tiger enclosures. He looked at his watch. It was 6:48. Emma still hadn't arrived. He tried her cell phone and got nothing. He walked toward the tigers. There were 3 of them, in 3 separate enclosures. Meru, the oldest, a male who had been born at the sanctuary and would probably die there. Bala, a young female who still didn't like people, and Riva. Riva was 5 years old, and she had come from a roadside zoo in Alabama that had lost its license 4 years back after a state inspector found the animals living on concrete slabs with no water. Riva had been the worst off of the ones they had been able to save. She had arrived at Crestwater at 98 pounds, a Bengal tiger who should have weighed at least 300, with a coat so dull it looked like ash. It had taken almost a year of steady food and quiet handling before she stopped flinching at the sight of a broom. Jason knew her better than he knew most people. He knew she liked the smell of fresh cedar shavings in her den. He knew she hissed softly at the sound of engines, but calmed down at the sound of a certain radio station he sometimes played through the outdoor speaker. He knew she watched him move around outside her enclosure with a stillness that always made him feel measured, weighed, considered. What he didn't know, and this was the thing he would think about for months afterward, was that Riva had been pregnant for almost 3 months. She had hidden it the way big cats hid it when they didn't trust their surroundings, keeping her belly down, her posture close, her routine unchanged. She had built a small nest behind the shelter panel at the back of her enclosure, tucked into a corner where the wind didn't reach, and Jason, who moved through her space twice a day, had walked past it without seeing. He had walked past it that very morning, in fact, when he had checked on her at 5:30. He had looked at her through the fence and said, "Hey, girl," and she had blinked at him without moving. He hadn't thought anything of it. He was thinking about it now, standing at the gate of her enclosure at 6:50 in the morning while the water rose behind him, because Riva was standing at the other end of the pen and she wouldn't come toward the transport crate. He tried the whistle he had trained her with. Nothing. He tried the food bucket he kept in the office for reluctant animals. Nothing. Riva stood at the back of the enclosure with her body low and her tail flat, and her eyes not on him but on something behind the shelter panel. Jason took a step forward, and Riva made a sound, not a roar, not a hiss, but a deep chest rumble that he had heard from her exactly twice before in 5 years. It meant, "Do not." That was when the main generator failed. It happened so fast that afterward Jason couldn't put the sequence together clearly. The generator cutting out, the automated locks, the ones that were supposed to seal the enclosure gates in an emergency, but which were on a fail-open system so animals wouldn't get trapped in a fire, the locks releasing on all 7 enclosures at once. The soft click of them, all of them, running through the property like the tick of some invisible clock. Riva heard it. She turned her head and looked at the gate of her pen, and then she looked at Jason, and then she looked at the water that had already reached the fence line, and then she did something that Jason has replayed in his head every day since. She walked. She didn't run. She didn't bolt. She didn't spring for the tree line where a big cat would have every instinct to go. She walked, slowly and deliberately, out of the open gate and into the flooded pasture. She waded thigh-deep in the brown current, and she turned once, just once, and looked back at the nest box behind her, and Jason understood only later what that look had been. Then she kept walking. Jason grabbed the catch-pole from the wall of the office and went after her. The water was cold, colder than it should have been for late September. It smelled like mud and motor oil and something rotten from the creek. Jason waded in with his coveralls pulling heavy around his legs, and he kept his eyes on Riva's back, the pale stripes moving between him and the parking lot, moving in a straight line toward Main Street. He caught up with her at the edge of the sanctuary road, where the water was still only knee-deep, and he saw for the first time what she was carrying. The cub was tiny, fist-sized, soaked and curled tight against itself. Its eyes were still sealed shut, and its ears were folded flat against its head. Reva held it in her jaws with a careful, ancient precision, the way a house cat carries a kitten, but higher, so much higher. Her whole head tilted upward, keeping the cub above the current. She was breathing hard. Jason could see her sides going in and out. He said her name, quiet, and she turned her head enough to see him, and then she kept walking. She didn't want to stop. He understood that. Wherever she thought she was going, she thought it was safer than where they had come from. Jason walked behind her, 30 feet back, the catchpole low, his hands starting to shake for the first time all morning. Up ahead, on the rise above Main Street, people had started to gather. Millhaven had been evacuating since dawn. The people at the top of the hill were the ones who had refused to leave, the ones who lived on the higher side of the road, the ones who owned the hardware store and the bakery and the old grain store that hadn't been used to store grain in 20 years. They stood in a loose cluster at the parking lot behind the diner, watching the water climb. And then they saw the tiger. Nobody screamed. Lena Dodd, 62 years old and Millhaven born her whole life, would say afterward that she couldn't have moved, even if she had wanted to. She had grown up on stories about the sanctuary. She had gone to the elementary school field trip when she was 7 and touched the fence of the lion enclosure. She had watched Jason Whitfield grow from a nervous 20-year-old who could barely make eye contact into the man he was now, and she had watched him drive that beat-up sanctuary truck past her front porch every morning for 11 years. She knew Crestwater the way you knew your own kitchen, but she had never seen anything like this. And later, when a reporter from a Louisville newspaper asked her to describe it, she would say that watching Reva wade across the floodplain with that cub in her jaws had been like watching a prayer walk. Someone beside her was crying without knowing why. Lena would remember that too, the sound of a grown man weeping quietly at her elbow, someone she had known since kindergarten, a man who had not cried at his own mother's funeral. Warren Halpin was in the crowd too. He was standing at the far end of the parking lot, near the pharmacy, and he had his phone out. He was filming. Jason didn't see him yet. Reva reached dry ground at the raised lot behind the hardware store, the old asphalt patch that used to be a lumberyard back when Millhaven still had a mill. She set the cub down in the mud, careful, the way a mother would set down a sleeping baby. She stood over it, sides heaving, and she looked around at the crowd for the first time. Nobody moved. Jason came up 2 minutes later, drenched to the chest, the catchpole still in his hand but lowered. He crouched 10 feet away from Reva, and he stayed still. The cub made a sound, thin and urgent, a mewling that was too small for a body of her size, and Reva pressed her nose to it and held it there. She was licking it now, gently, with a kind of focused urgency that Jason had seen in mother cats his whole life, but never like this. Never with a tiger, never in a flooded parking lot in the middle of his hometown. He should have been afraid. That is what he thought afterward. He should have been afraid, because a wet tiger with a newborn cub in an open lot with 30 civilians 10 yards away was a scenario that should have ended one way, and one way only. But he wasn't afraid. He was crying quietly, without knowing he was crying, and he was watching Reva work. That was when Lena Dodd walked forward. Nobody had expected her to. Later, when people talked about that morning, they always got to the part about Lena, 62, retired librarian, arthritis in both knees, walking out across the wet asphalt toward a tiger. She didn't get close. She stopped 15 feet back behind Jason, and she took off her rain jacket. She held it out. Jason turned his head. He said, "Lena, you shouldn't be out here." She said, "Take it, honey." He said, "I'm okay." She said, "I know you are. It's not for you." He understood her. He took the jacket. He waited until Reva looked at him. She did, once, her yellow eyes tracking him with an intelligence that Jason had never fully gotten used to, and he moved forward slowly, 1 foot at a time, and he set the jacket down in the mud 6 feet from where the cub was lying. Then he backed away. Reva watched him do it. She didn't move to pick up the jacket, but she saw it, and after a long, slow moment, she reached out with one enormous paw and dragged the jacket toward the cub, and she laid down beside her daughter with the fabric pulled up like a blanket, and she covered the small, wet body with the corner of it. Nobody in the parking lot made a sound. That's when Warren Halpern, still standing at the far end of the lot near the pharmacy, spoke. He said, loud enough for at least 11 people to hear him, that things shouldn't be loose in a town. Nobody answered him. But Jason heard it, and Lena Dodd heard it. And she turned her head and looked at Warren Halpern for a long moment, and she remembered his face. She would need to remember it later. The rest of that morning would blur later into a single long moment in Jason's memory. He would remember Emma Reyes finally arriving with her father's aluminum flat-bottom boat pulled up onto the mud beside the diner at 7:21. He would remember the state animal rescue truck arriving from Louisville at 9:43. He would remember Sheriff Diane Corbett showing up at the parking lot and putting up a yellow tape line around Reva and her cub in a wide, loose circle. And then he would remember the way she had stood there with her arms crossed and told the crowd that nobody, and she meant nobody, was crossing that tape until the sanctuary team had this situation in hand. He would remember Lena Dodd bringing him a thermos of hot coffee at 10:15. He would remember the National Guard sandbagging the road at 11. He would remember Reva finally letting them approach with a transport crate at 1:17 in the afternoon, not tranquilized, not trapped, just allowing them, the way she had allowed everything since she had waded out of that enclosure at 7 in the morning. They moved her to the high pen behind the office, where Nora and the lions were already housed. Reva walked into the crate herself, with the cub held against her belly by her front paw. She turned around once inside it, and she lay down, and she looked at Jason through the mesh, and she made that low chest call again, the one that wasn't a growl and wasn't a warning, and that Jason would eventually understand to mean something he had never quite let himself put into words. By the time the crate was locked in the high pen, and Jason had his first dry pair of coveralls on, it was 3:30 in the afternoon, and Millhaven had lost half its downtown to the flood. The sanctuary itself had lost 2 enclosures, the main office and the pole barn. Nora's temporary holding was cracked. The pole barn was going to have to come down. The generator was gone. The vet supplies were ruined. They had lost everything they could stand to lose. They had not lost a single animal. Jason sat down on an overturned bucket at the edge of the high pen at 4 o'clock that afternoon, and he cried for the first time in 11 years. He cried like a man who had held something in for so long that he had forgotten what letting it go felt like. Emma Reyes sat next to him on the ground and put her hand on his shoulder and didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say. That night, Jason took his phone out of his pocket and opened the sanctuary's social media account for the first time in 3 weeks. He typed a single paragraph. He wrote, "Today the levee broke and our sanctuary flooded. We lost buildings. We didn't lose any of our animals. One of our tigers, a female named Reva, who came to us 4 years ago after a bad situation in Alabama, carried her newborn daughter across half a mile of floodwater to dry ground while our whole town watched. She trusted us. We can't tell her thank you, but we can try to give her a life worth what she did. If you want to help us rebuild, the link is below. Whatever you can spare." He hit post. He put the phone down. He didn't check it again until morning. By 7 o'clock the next day, the post had been shared 47,000 times. By noon, it had passed 120,000. By nightfall, it was at 240,000 shares. And the sanctuary's donation page had received contributions from 47 states and 11 countries. Jason woke up on Sunday morning to a phone that had 1,300 unread messages, and he sat on the porch of his rental in the dark and cried again. And this time, Emma Reyes brought him a cup of coffee and pretended not to notice. That was the good part of the story. The bad part started on Tuesday. On Tuesday morning, Warren Halpern posted a video. He posted it to the community Facebook page that most of Millhaven used, and he had edited it. That was the part that Jason still couldn't get over, months later. He had edited it. He had taken his phone footage from the parking lot on Saturday morning, and he had cut it carefully into 18 seconds of Reva moving through the water with her ears back and her tail low, followed by Warren's own voice, added in post, saying that if it hadn't been for the mercy of God, there would have been children mauled in the streets of Millhaven on the morning of the flood, and that the Crestwater Big Cat Sanctuary had been operating in criminal negligence for 11 years, and that if the county commissioners didn't act to shut it down immediately, they would be personally responsible for the next attack. By 10 in the morning, the video had been shared 4,000 times inside Millhaven, and a version of it had made it to a regional news station in Bowling Green. By noon, 3 national news outlets had reached out to Jason for comment. He didn't answer any of them. Lena Dodd did. She walked into the Millhaven Town Hall at 1:30 on Tuesday afternoon with a printed copy of Warren's video transcript and a 2-page statement she had written by hand on lined notebook paper the night before, and she asked to be recorded on the record. The clerk on duty was her cousin's daughter. She said yes. Lena's statement, later posted in full on the sanctuary's page and eventually read aloud on 3 different national morning shows, said what Jason didn't know how to say. It said that she had watched the entire event from the parking lot behind the diner. It said that at no point had the tiger threatened any human being. It said that the tiger had crossed a flooded pasture to save her cub, and that Warren Halpern had stood at the far end of the parking lot with his phone out for the entire event, and that Lena had been watching him more closely than he had realized, because Lena Dodd had known Warren Halpern since he was in the 5th grade, and she had never trusted him, and she wasn't about to start now. It said at the end that if there was anyone in Millhaven who wanted to shut down the sanctuary, they were going to have to go through her first. By 4 in the afternoon on Tuesday, Lena's statement had 5 million views. Warren Halpern took down his video that evening, but it was too late. By then, 2 things had happened that Jason wouldn't fully understand for another week. The first was that the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife had opened a formal inspection into the Crestwater Big Cat Sanctuary on the grounds of possible violations related to animal containment during the flood event. The second was that a formal complaint had been filed with the County Planning Commission, alleging that the sanctuary was operating outside of its permitted zoning and requesting an injunction to prevent any rebuilding on the current site. The complaint had been filed by a private citizen. The citizen was Warren Halpern. That was the twist, Jason would think later. That was the moment he understood. Because Warren Halpern's family, the Halperns who had donated the sanctuary land in the 1960s, the Halperns whose grandmother, Elizabeth Halpern, had left a piece of her own farmland to be held in perpetuity as a wildlife refuge. That family had a business now, a development company run out of Louisville, and the development company had, in the past 6 years, purchased every piece of undeveloped land within a mile of the sanctuary, every single piece. And the sanctuary land, 62 acres of gently rolling former pasture with creek frontage, was the last piece Warren Halpern didn't own. Jason found this out at 7:15 on Thursday night. Emma Reyes had spent 2 days in the archives at the county courthouse. Emma, who was studying to be a veterinarian and had never touched a property deed in her life. Emma had gone through every filing related to the Halpin land grant and every subsequent purchase by Warren Halpin's development company, and she had come out of the courthouse basement covered in dust, with a folder under her arm and a look on her face that Jason had never seen on a 19-year-old before. She spread the papers on the kitchen table of Jason's rental at 7:15 at night, and she pointed to a plat map, and she said, "Look." Jason looked. The sanctuary sat in the middle of a ring of 11 parcels, all owned by Halpin Development Group. The 11 parcels formed a rough donut around Crestwater. If you took out the sanctuary, the ring became a solid 230-acre block of contiguous land, a block big enough for what one of the filings in Emma's folder described as a mixed-use planned community with over 400 housing units. Warren Halpin wasn't trying to shut down the sanctuary because of the tiger. He was trying to shut it down because he needed the land. He had been trying to shut it down for years. The flood had just given him a public excuse. Jason sat at his kitchen table and looked at the plat map, and he felt something he hadn't felt in 11 years of working at Crestwater. He felt something clean and cold and useful. He felt angry. He said, "Emma, we need a lawyer." Emma said, "I already called one." Her name was Renee Whitcomb. She had graduated from the University of Louisville Law School in 2011, and she had grown up 2 blocks from Emma Reyes, and she had done pro bono work for 3 regional wildlife nonprofits in the past 4 years. She agreed to represent the sanctuary at cost. She met with Jason and Emma on Friday morning at the coffee shop in Owensboro that had reopened after the flood, and she said what Jason needed to hear. She said, "They're going to move fast. They're going to try to get the injunction heard before you can rebuild. If they can get the sanctuary declared out of compliance while you have no buildings and no permits pulled, they can force a sale." Jason said, "How long do we have?" Renee said, 22 days. That was Friday, October 3rd. The hearing was set for October 25th. 22 days. Jason drove back to the sanctuary that afternoon, and he went straight to the high pen. Reva was lying on her side in the temporary holding, and the cub, a female, whom Emma had started calling Willa, was curled against her belly. Willa was small. She was steady. She had opened her eyes on October 12th, and she had looked up at Jason through the mesh of the high pen, and she had blinked twice before turning her head back to her mother's flank. The sanctuary's on-call veterinarian, Dr. Marissa Turner, had been out at Crestwater twice a day since Sunday. She was watching Willa. She was watching Reva harder. She was quiet, quieter than she usually was. Something about the way she looked at Reva was different from the way she had looked at any of the other cats in the 8 years she had done contract work for the sanctuary. On Saturday morning, Dr. Turner asked Jason to sit down at the picnic table outside the high pen. She said, "I need to tell you something." She said, "I recognized her." Jason said, "What do you mean?" Dr. Turner said, 4 years ago, I was on the state inspection team that went into the roadside zoo in Alabama where your girl came from. I was one of the vets they brought in to evaluate the animals for transport. I processed her intake papers." Jason said, "Okay." Dr. Turner said she had cubs there. Twice. Before we got there, she lost them both times. Nobody at the sanctuary ever knew about it because it wasn't in her transport file. I did not put it in her transport file. She was in a state where I was worried she wouldn't recover if her intake paperwork was heavy, and I made a decision I probably shouldn't have. That's on me." Jason said, "Oh." Dr. Turner said she knew. "That's the thing I need you to understand. She knew what had happened to her before. She has been carrying that for 4 years, and the reason she hid this pregnancy from you isn't because she doesn't trust you. It's because she doesn't trust anyone ever again with cubs in her body." Jason didn't say anything. He couldn't. Dr. Turner said, "And Jason, when the flood came, when she saw the water rise, she didn't run for the tree line because she didn't believe the tree line was safe. She waded toward the town because she believed you were somewhere in the town. and she wanted to bring you her daughter herself, so that if she lost her, she would at least have brought her to somebody who would tell her what happened. Jason put his face in his hands. Dr. Turner said, "I'm not supposed to say things like this in a professional capacity. I know that. But I've been doing this for 23 years, and I've never seen an animal make the choice she made on Saturday, and I need you to know why she made it." That afternoon, Jason walked back up to the high pen, and he sat down on the ground outside the mesh, and Reva lifted her head, and she looked at him the way she had looked at him 1,000 times over the past 4 years, and for the first time, Jason understood what he was looking at. He wasn't looking at a big cat. He was looking at a mother who had lost 2 families and had decided, in the middle of a flood, to bet everything on one last try. He stayed with her until the sky went red over the ridge. He said things to her that he had never said out loud to anyone, and he didn't remember most of them afterward. He said thank you 3 or 4 times. He said, "I'm sorry" more times than that. Reva made the low chest call. She made it twice. The rest of that week moved fast. Renee Whitcomb filed the sanctuary's response to Warren Halpen's injunction on Monday, October 6th. The response argued that the sanctuary land was subject to a perpetual conservation covenant that had been established at the time of the original Halpen donation in the 1960s. And that any attempt to rezone or sell the land was legally impossible. Warren Halpen's lawyer, a Louisville man named Frank Marley, responded on Tuesday with a filing of his own. Marley's filing produced a document, an addendum to the original Halpen donation, that appeared to release the conservation covenant in the event that the sanctuary ceased to operate as a functional wildlife refuge for any period exceeding 6 months. The sanctuary was, at that moment, not operating as a functional wildlife refuge. It couldn't. 2 of its enclosures were destroyed. Its main office was gone. Its animals were living in a temporary holding pen. The sanctuary had, by the definition in the addendum Warren Halpen's lawyer had just produced, ceased to operate the day the levee broke. Renee Whitcomb read the addendum on Wednesday morning at her office in Owensboro, and she called Jason at 10:45, and she said, "We have a problem." Jason said, "How bad?" Renee said, "It's bad. If this addendum is valid, and if the court agrees that the sanctuary has ceased to operate as of September 27th, then the covenant is released and Halpen can move to purchase." Jason said, "Is it valid?" Renee said, "I don't know yet. The signature on it looks right. The witness names on it look right. It was filed with the county in 1973, 10 years after the original donation. If it's authentic, we're in real trouble." Jason said, "If it isn't." Renee said, "If it isn't, we've caught Warren Halpen committing document fraud, and I promise you, he'll wish he'd never heard of Crestwater." Emma Reyes went back to the courthouse basement on Thursday. She went with a purpose this time. She was looking for the original addendum in the physical archive. She had been down there for 6 hours when the county archivist, an old woman named Marjorie Beale, who had been running the courthouse basement for 31 years, brought her a folder from the very back of the shelving unit. Marjorie Beale set the folder down on the reading table and she said, "I've had this folder in the same spot for 31 years, honey. Nobody has ever asked to see it. But when I heard what was happening at the sanctuary, I remembered it. Take a look." Emma opened the folder. Inside was the original Halpen donation deed, signed by Elizabeth Halpen in 1963. Emma had already seen a copy of it, but behind the deed was something Emma hadn't seen before. It was a handwritten letter, dated the same day as the deed, on the personal stationery of Elizabeth Halpen. Emma read the letter. Elizabeth Halpen had written in her own hand that the 62 acres of her family's farmland that she was donating to the newly formed Crestwater Wildlife Foundation were to be held in perpetuity for the care of wild animals in need. She had written that no member of her family and no descendant of any member of her family should ever be permitted to reclaim, sell, develop, or otherwise dispose of the property under any circumstances. She had written that the reason for this was that she had lost her own son, Michael Halpern, at the age of 31, to a preventable accident on a private preserve owned by a man who had kept exotic animals in cages for entertainment. Elizabeth had written that no other mother should ever bury a child because of the way wild things were treated in this country. She had signed the letter, and she had had it witnessed by 3 people, all of whom had signed with her, all in the same ink. Michael Halpern, Warren Halpern's uncle, the man Warren Halpern had been named after. Warren was his middle name, according to the family Bible Emma had found in the courthouse archive, along with the letter. But the first name he had rejected in the 6th grade because he didn't like it. His full legal name was Michael Warren Halpern. Emma sat in the courthouse basement with Elizabeth Halpern's handwritten letter in her hands, and she started to cry. Marjorie Beale patted her shoulder. Marjorie said, "Take pictures, take a lot of pictures, and then let me put the original back in the folder, honey, because this thing hasn't left this basement in 51 years, and I don't want to be the one who lost it." Emma took 43 pictures. She drove back to the sanctuary at 9:30 that night, and she showed Jason the pictures on her laptop, and Jason sat on his kitchen floor and looked at the photos of Elizabeth Halpern's handwriting, and he said, "Oh my God." The hearing was on October 25th, 14 days away. The addendum Warren Halpern's lawyer had produced, the one that supposedly released the conservation covenant if the sanctuary ceased to operate, had been signed by 3 witnesses. Renee Whitcomb had those names by Friday morning. 2 of them were dead. One was still alive. His name was Harold Priddy. He was 91 years old and lived in a nursing home in Elizabethtown, Kentucky. Renee drove to Elizabethtown on Saturday morning, and she spent 3 hours with Harold Priddy in the common room of the Golden Meadows retirement community. And when she came back that afternoon, she called Jason, and she said, "We have him." Jason said, "We have what?" Renee said, "Harold Priddy has advanced macular degeneration. He has for the last 12 years, but he remembers signing that addendum, and he remembers who asked him to sign it. And it wasn't the Halpern family. It was a man named Delbert Kraft, who worked as a private legal consultant for the Halpern Development Group from 1989 until his death in 2011. The addendum was filed with the county in 1973, but Harold Priddy didn't sign it in 1973. He signed it in 1994. He knows because his grandson was born the week he signed it. And he came to the meeting in his church clothes because he was going to the hospital right after. Jason said, "So the addendum is a forgery." Renee said, "The addendum is a backdated fraud." Delbert Kraft filed it retroactively with fake witness dates to lay the groundwork for exactly what Warren Halpern is trying to do now. And I have a 91-year-old man who is willing to testify to it under oath. And I have a forensic document examiner from the State Attorney General's office who has agreed to look at the ink on the addendum. Ink dating has been solid on cases going back 40 years. If the ink is post-1990, the addendum is done. Jason said, "How much time?" Renee said, "We'll have the ink report before the hearing." That was Saturday, October 11th. On Monday morning, October 13th, Warren Halpern drove out to the sanctuary himself. Jason was working with Emma at the site of the destroyed pole barn. They were pulling nails out of a beam. Warren pulled up in a black SUV and rolled the window down and told Jason he wanted to talk. Jason set down the crowbar and walked over. Warren didn't get out of the car. He said, "This is going to end badly for you, Jason." Jason said, "Is that a threat?" Warren said, "It's an offer. My company will pay you $850,000 for the 62 acres. That's twice what the appraisal says the land is worth. You take that money, you find another site, you keep your animals, you keep your job, and everybody walks away without going through a hearing that is going to embarrass a lot of people in this county." Jason said no. Warren said, "Think about it. You have 2 weeks." Jason said no. Warren said, "I'm being polite, Jason." Jason said, "I heard you the first time." Warren rolled up the window and drove away. That night, Jason wrote down every word of the conversation while it was still fresh in his memory, and he emailed the notes to Renee Whitcomb. Renee replied at 11:22 with a single sentence. She wrote, "He just handed us his intent." The ink report came back on October 22nd. The ink on Delbert Craft's addendum was a compound that had first been introduced by a specific ink manufacturer in 1988. The addendum could not have been signed in 1973. It was a forgery, produced sometime after 1988, backdated by 20-plus years. Warren Halpern didn't know this yet. Neither did his lawyer, Frank Marley. The State Attorney General's office had classified the ink report as material to an ongoing investigation into potential document fraud by the Halpern Development Group, and Renee Whitcomb had agreed to hold the report until the hearing. Emma Reyes and Jason and Renee sat in Jason's kitchen on the night of October 24th. Reva and Willa were sleeping in the high pen behind the sanctuary. Willa was gaining weight steadily now. She had grown enough in 3 weeks that she looked from a distance like a small orange dog. At 10:15 that night, Jason walked out to the high pen alone. He sat down on the ground outside the mesh, and Reva looked at him, and Jason said quietly, "If this goes wrong tomorrow, I don't know what happens to you. I want you to know that. I want you to know I tried." Reva watched him. She didn't move. Jason said, "I'm sorry about the other 2 litters. I'm sorry about all of it. I don't know if you can hear me. I don't know what any of this means to you. But I want you to know." Reva made the low chest call, the one Jason had heard 4 times in his life now. She made it once, softly, and then she lay her head back down on her forepaws. The hearing was at 9 in the morning the next day at the county courthouse in Millhaven. Warren Halpern arrived at 8:40 in a grey suit. He was smiling. He was talking to his lawyer, Frank Marley. He didn't notice Lena Dodd sitting in the back row of the courtroom, or Emma Reyes sitting 2 rows in front of her, or Sheriff Diane Corbett standing at the courtroom door with her arms crossed. He noticed Jason. He nodded at Jason without meaning it. The judge was a woman named Regina Vaughn. She had been on the bench in Millhaven for 19 years. She was known for 2 things, for being fair and for being fast. The hearing started at 9:02. Frank Marley presented Warren Halpern's case first. He argued that the Crestwater Big Cat Sanctuary had ceased to operate as a wildlife refuge as of September 27th. That under the terms of the 1973 addendum to the original Halpern donation, the Conservation Covenant was thereby released, and that his client, as the surviving direct descendant of the original grantor, was entitled to reclaim the property. Frank Marley talked for 32 minutes. Then Renee Whitcomb stood up. She spoke for 11 minutes. She began by reading Elizabeth Halpern's handwritten letter from 1963 in its entirety into the record. She read the passage about Michael Halpern, 31 years old, dead on a private preserve where a man had kept exotic animals in cages for entertainment, and she read the passage about no other mother ever burying a child for that reason. She read Elizabeth Halpern's declaration that no descendant of her family should ever reclaim the land under any circumstances. She heard Warren Halpern shift in his chair behind her. She didn't turn around. Then she introduced the ink report on the addendum. She read the finding. She entered Harold Priddy's sworn affidavit into evidence. She entered the Kentucky Attorney General's investigation notice on Halpern Development Group into evidence. She entered Jason's contemporaneous notes on Warren Halpern's Monday visit to the sanctuary into evidence. She sat down. Frank Marley stood up. He said, "Your Honor, we need a continuance to review these materials." Judge Regina Vaughn looked at him for a long moment. She said, "The plaintiff's case rests on a document that is being investigated as a forgery. There will be no continuance. There will be a ruling." She ruled at 9:57 in the morning. She denied Warren Halpern's injunction. She dismissed the complaint. She referred the entire matter of the 1973 addendum to the Kentucky Attorney General's office for further prosecution. She added on the record that if she saw another filing from Halpern Development Group against the Crestwater Big Cat Sanctuary in her lifetime, she would be personally interested in reviewing it. Warren Halpern didn't say anything. He walked out of the courtroom at 9:59 in the morning without looking at anyone. Frank Marley followed him. Neither of them spoke to the reporters waiting in the hallway. By 11 in the morning, the story was national. By 3 in the afternoon, the Kentucky Attorney General's office had announced a criminal investigation into Halpern Development Group. By 6 that evening, a coalition of 8 national wildlife conservation groups had pledged over $2 million in matching funds to help Crestwater rebuild. Jason drove back to the sanctuary at 7 o'clock that evening. It was almost dark. He parked at the top of the hill and walked down to the high pen. Emma was there. Lena was there. Sheriff Corbett had brought a plate of casserole and had gone home. Dr. Turner was standing at the edge of the mesh with a clipboard, taking notes on Willa's weight for the day. Riva was lying on her side. Willa was nursing. She was almost 6 weeks old now. She was starting to walk in the wobbly, determined way of any young thing, and every so often she would push away from her mother and take 3 or 4 steps toward the mesh, and then look back at Riva as if to check she still had permission. Riva would twitch her tail once. Willa would toddle back. Jason sat down on the ground. He said, quiet enough that only Emma could hear, "We did it." Emma said, "Yeah. We did." The sanctuary was rebuilt over the following 8 months. The lawyers took another 11 months, but by the following August, Halpern Development Group had been dissolved by court order after a plea deal that involved fines, forfeitures, and a 5-year prohibition on any principal of the company being permitted to file property claims in the state of Kentucky. Warren Halpern himself pleaded down to a document fraud charge that involved 2 years of probation and a lifetime bar on holding public office. His planned community was never built. The land his company had bought around the sanctuary was sold, parcel by parcel, at auction. 3 of the parcels were purchased by the Kentucky Land Trust and folded into a wildlife corridor that connected the sanctuary to a nearby state forest. The corridor was named, in a small ceremony that summer, the Michael Halpern Memorial Passage, at the request of a woman named Grace Halpern, a great-granddaughter of Elizabeth Halpern from a different branch of the family, who had watched the whole story unfold on the news and had reached out to Renee Whitcomb the day after the hearing. Grace read her great-grandmother's letter aloud at the dedication of the passage. She cried while reading the part about Michael. When she finished, she put the letter down on the podium, and she said, "This land is where my great-grandmother wanted it to be, and my family is proud of her for it." That was the end of her speech. The 62 acres of Crestwater were, that same August, entered into the Kentucky Land Trust as a permanent conservation preserve, protected in perpetuity, with a fresh set of covenants that would have been very difficult to break, even if anyone had wanted to try. Nobody wanted to try. Warren Halpern was working by then at a hardware store in a town 2 hours away. He did not return calls from journalists. Riva and Willa were transferred 14 months after the flood to a permanent big cat facility in Colorado, on a ridge that sat almost 7,000 feet above sea level and well above any conceivable floodplain. The facility had 38 acres of natural habitat, a full veterinary clinic, and a staff of 11 full-time keepers, one of whom was Emma Reyes, who had finished her veterinary degree the previous May. Willa grew into a 230-pound female tiger with a temperament, Emma would say, like her mother's, steady, watchful, unafraid. She liked, more than anything else, the particular smell of cedar shavings that Emma still put in the corner of her den every morning. Riva lived for 6 more years after the flood. She died in the summer of the 6th year of natural causes. She was surrounded, at the end, by her daughter, grown now, big, watchful, and by Emma Reyes, who was 30 years old by then, and by Jason Whitfield, who had driven out to Colorado the moment Emma called him. Jason took a small photograph home with him from Colorado that summer. He kept it on the dashboard of his truck. It was a photograph of a muddy asphalt lot behind an old hardware store in Millhaven, Kentucky. There wasn't anything in the picture, really. Just the mud. Just the empty lot where, on a Saturday morning in September, a Bengal tiger named Reva had crossed half a mile of flooded pasture with her newborn daughter held above the water in her jaws, and where a whole town, 30 people in the rain, had held its breath and understood all at once that they were watching something they would never see again. There is a moment in that photograph, if you look at it long enough, where you can almost see the pattern of a footprint in the mud near the middle of the lot. A single wide paw print, deep, angled slightly to one side, the way an animal steps when she's carrying something precious and has decided not to drop it, no matter what. The print doesn't lead anywhere. It's just there, in the middle of the frame, alone. Jason kept the photograph on his dashboard for the rest of his life. He saw it every single day. Some mornings, driving to work, he would catch it out of the corner of his eye at a red light, and he would remember standing thigh-deep in cold water at 7 in the morning with a catch pole in his hand and a woman he barely knew crying at his elbow. And he would remember Reva walking, not running, not fleeing, but walking, slow and steady, straight toward the town she had decided to trust. And he would think about all the things human beings sometimes decide are impossible about the world, and about the way animals go on doing them anyway. He would think about what it meant that a creature born into cruelty had chosen, at the moment the water rose, to wade toward a human being with her daughter in her mouth. He would think that maybe every good thing in this life is somebody or something deciding to walk toward the light instead of away. And then the light would turn green, and Jason would drive onto the sanctuary where there were fresh cedar shavings to put in the empty pens, and new animals arriving from bad places, and a small girl named Grace Halpin, who now sat on the board of directors and came out every Saturday to help clean the Caracal's water bowls, and a whole rebuilt life waiting for him under the ridge. If this story moved you the way it moved me while I was telling it, do the kind thing and drop a comment below. Tell me what part hit you the hardest. Hit that like button so more people can find this story. And if you're new here, subscribe and stick around, because there are more stories like this coming. Stories about the small, quiet, unbelievable things that happen in this world when the water rises and somebody or something chooses to walk toward it instead of away.